Hey guys, just wanted to go over with you a quick lesson today, what we covered in our Zoom class for those of you that weren't able to make it, and hopefully you'll get to watch this. And I would put this information in your notes so you have access to it for studying for test or when you're taking a test. So one thing I wanted to go over real quick, I mentioned this in a couple of my classes last week, but I forgot to mention it in one of my classes. So I want to make sure that you are aware of it. So this idea of that organisms share the same habitat but occupy a different niche. Okay, so or niche. I'm sorry. Clarify how to pronounce that. I've heard it pronounced both ways, so probably the more technical way of pronouncing it is niche, but sometimes you might have heard it called a niche. Now, what that means is, so the habitat. Real quick, let's define these two. A habitat is just simply a place that an organism lives out its life. Okay. That is what a habitat is. Pretty easy if we were to think about a red-tailed hawk that lives out in the prairie. The habitat where it lives, that's its habitat, okay, where it lives. Now, this idea of a niche is basically what that organism does in that habitat. So we can define that as all of the interactions with the biotic and abiotic parts of its habitat, or it's basically its job. So you can think about what it does in that prairie, that red-tailed hawk. It is a top predator. It is a consumer of mice and snakes and different things like that in its environment. And so that's kind of what its niche is. If we were to look at a buzzard, for example, a buzzard is going to have a different niche. And they might live in the same habitat, but the buzzard's a scavenger, right? So it's going to be feeding off dead things. And I think I lost my connection there. Let me pull this back up. All right, so that's a little bit about a niche in a habitat. So now let's get into what we're going to cover today. All right, today we're going to start off with talking about food webs and food chains and things like that, and make our way through a few things. First thing we're going to talk about is a food chain. So a food chain is just a simple model that's going to show how matter and energy flow through an ecosystem. Food chains are typically about 3 to 4 links long, maybe a little shorter, maybe a little longer, but they're not going to be real long. In fact, I challenged my class today in my Zoom meetings to come up with a food chain that's 5 links long. It's not easy to do. If you want to pause it and think of one on your own here, you can go ahead and do that this time. But I want to go ahead and give you an example of one. Can you come up with a food chain that's 5 links long? And here's the example that I came up with is this here. Get this shrink down to the window. We might have so any food chain, you're always going to start off with that producer. So grass or some type of plant. Grasshopper eats the grass. Frog eats the grasshopper. Snake eats the frog. Hawk eats the snake. Now, one of the things I forgot to mention in the challenge is not to include humans, A, and B, don't try to come up with this idea of there's always a bigger fish, okay? We think about in a pond or an ocean, a little fish gets eaten by a bigger fish, which gets eaten by a bigger fish, which gets eaten by an even bigger fish. Don't do that, and it's kind of tricky to come up with one that's 5 links long. Now, typically, you're going to want to start off small when you're making these. Now, and that way you can get a little bit bigger. Now, why aren't they longer? A couple of reasons. Probably the main reasons why you don't see really long food chains is because of the amount of energy available. So as you go if you have several links in that food chain, you're going to run out of energy before you get to that top predator. So another reason why they can tend to be a little bit shorter is just for the stability factor. If you have a really long food chain, they tend to be a little more unstable. If one population of one organism in that food chain goes extinct, it can really have dramatic effects on the other individuals when you have one that's really long, things like that. So that can cause a problem. So let's move on to this next concept, is a food web. Before we get that, I do want to mention this. Each organism in a food chain is going to represent what we call a feeding step or a trophic level. Okay, a feeding step or trophic level. Last week we talked about autotroph and a heterotroph. And so the word troph means feeding. Okay, so a trophic level is just a feeding level in that food web. So let's look at a food web here, I think next. So a food web is going to show all possible feeding relationships at each trophic level in a community. So the main thing about a food web that you want to keep in mind is that the arrows are going to indicate the flow of energy. All right, that's the main thing you want to keep in mind in a food web. So let's look at an example of a food web. And it should make sense when we talk about the arrows indicating the flow of energy. Sometimes people want to go in and say, well, the arrows are showing what something is going to eat. And look at this food web. Does that make sense? I mean, if we have berries and flowers pointing to this bear, we kind of know that berries and flowers don't consume bears, right? Berries and flowers don't eat grouse or butterflies. Grasses don't eat marmots or deer. Deer don't eat bears, right? So that isn't. So the arrows are going to indicate the flow of energy. So energy is going to flow from the producer to the consumer, the producer to the consumer to another consumer. So that is what these arrows always indicate, is the flow of energy. Now, you might ask, what's the difference between a food chain and a food web? Well, a food web is just showing you all of those interactions, all the different food chains together. So if you look at this, there's several food chains in this one food web. You have, so the berries and to the bear, that's one food chain. The berries to the grouse to the hawk is another food chain. Or we could go from the berries to the butterfly to the grouse to the hawk. So that is a food chain. So you have several different food chains within this one food web. Okay, food webs are typically more complex. Next thing we talked about today was this concept that if you have one or group of organisms or one population within this community that let's say they go extinct, or maybe their numbers increase really a large amount, how does that affect the other organisms? So there's kind of two schools of thought. The first one is what we call the rivet model. Think about the rivets in like an airplane. So the rivets hold all the sheets of metal together, forming the outside of that plane. If you were to take one of those rivets off, it could have a dramatic effect on the other rivets, sorry, not a frog, surrounding that rivet. And so reducing or increasing the abundance of just one species can affect many other species in this rivet model. If you take that one species out, is it going to cause another species or population to go extinct in that area? That's what we're talking about with this rivet model. The other one is what we call the redundancy model. The redundancy model, in that an increase or a decrease in one species has little or no effect on other species. Typically, a more stable community is going to undergo this redundancy model. If one population numbers get low, something else is going to step in and take its place. It doesn't really affect it. Your really fragile communities or ecosystems that are typically in harsher conditions are going to be more like the rivet model. If one population numbers get low or big, it will have dramatic effects on other populations within that ecosystem. So be familiar with those two. Next thing we're going to talk about are energy pyramids. So an energy pyramid is just going to show you how energy passes through a food chain. So what you'll notice here are some terms. First of all, we start off with our producer or autotroph. Whatever eats those we call the primary consumer. We learned last week that we call those herbivores, right? The consumer that eats the autotroph are herbivores. So, but for our purposes, we're really going to focus on this word primary consumer. And then whatever eats the primary consumer is the secondary consumer. And then whatever eats the secondary consumer is the tertiary consumer, or third level. And then we could even go one more higher than that, would be what we would call a quaternary, the fourth level, okay? Fourth for quaternary. So the main thing about the energy pyramids that you need to know is only about 10% of energy is going to pass from one trophic level to the next. So, for example, let me pull up another energy pyramid here. This one here. If we start off with 9,000 kilocalories in these producers down here. That means only about 10% are going to be available for that, are going to pass to that primary consumer. So you can just take a 0 off and you have 900 kilocalories. And then only about 10% of that will go to the next. So take another 0, you have 90 kilocalories per square meter available. And then you go to the next level, you take it off another 0 and you only have 9 kilocalories per square meter per year. So hopefully that makes sense. And again, we talked about how that's one reason why these food chains aren't really long, because we start running out of energy. Going back to this previous picture, I want to clarify something real quick. Now with this one, notice how it says 10% here and it says 1% and then 0.1%. What that is demonstrating is 10% of that original 100%. This 1% is of that original 100%. And this 0.1 is of that original 100. So that's another way you can look at that. Or just say 10% from this level, 10% from that, 10% from that will get you that same number. Add a 0, take off a 0, whichever way you're going. If you're going up, you're going to be taking away a 0. If you're going down, if they give you a lower number to start with and want to know how much is at the producer, you would just add zeros to each level. Okay, hopefully that makes sense when we're dealing with energy pyramids. So let's go ahead and look at the last thing here are going to be nutrient cycles. Okay, cycles in nature. Unlike energy, which is continually replenished, matter is recycled in the environment. So we're going to be looking at 3 primary nutrient cycles. The first one is one you're probably pretty familiar with, is the water cycle. So the water cycle, a couple terms you may not be as familiar with is this word here, percolation. That's just how the water percolates through the soil or kind of filters through the soil. It will typically get down into the water table or an underground aquifer and find its way into an underground stream to make its way to a river or lake or ocean or something like that. So that's what that word means. And then the other one you may not be as familiar with is transpiration. So here it's called evapotranspiration. So transpiration is how water will evaporate out of a leaf into the atmosphere, and so out of the leaf of plants. So it's a very common process that's part of the water cycle. Real quick, I want to mention that the water cycle, the amount of water that's present today is the same as has always been. We don't lose water on Earth. It just changes one form to the next. You know, it's in liquid form or vapor or ice or different forms. And if one area of the world is undergoing a drought, there's probably another area that's having floods. So it's always this cycle is going to go around, and we don't lose or gain water. It just changes forms in different parts of the world. The next cycle is this one is the carbon cycle. A couple things I want to point out here. You'll notice that you have arrows going into the tree here. So we think about the process of photosynthesis, plants taking in CO2 to form food for themselves. Now here you'll see an arrow going away from a plant. That's not talking about oxygen that plants give off for photosynthesis. That's CO2 again that plants would give off for cellular respiration. Because if you remember, we talked about a couple weeks ago that plants do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. They make food for photosynthesis, and then they have to break that food down for energy through cellular respiration. And when they break that food down, they release CO2 as a byproduct. So the arrows coming off the bobcat and the rabbit here and the tree, these are all talking about CO2 that they give off through cellular respiration as they break down the food that they eat. A couple of other terms you may not be familiar with, detritus and detrivore. So detritus is dead and decaying organic matter, whether it's from an animal or plant or whatever. And as it's being broken down, we call it detritus. And usually through that decomposition, detrivores, which are typically like bacteria, fungus, things like that that live in the soil, will break that down and keep as part of that carbon cycle. So as they're breaking it down, they're releasing CO2 in the atmosphere, and it's being brought in by plants and things like that. So that's what we're talking about within that carbon cycle. The last cycle I want to mention is a nitrogen cycle. And real quickly about the nitrogen cycle, we talked about nitrogen fixation last week.